Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's really a pleasure to welcome all of you here this afternoon for our 2019 Herbert W. Vaughan lecture. As you know, or many of you know, this is the big event annually in the Madison program, and we're absolutely delighted to have a speaker of the eminence of Adrian Vermeule to be our Vaughan lecturer this year. Before introducing Professor Vermeule, I've got a couple of other items to take care of. First, I want to remind you, because anyone who's here who's interested in Adrian's work and in the topic of this lecture will undoubtedly be interested in the conference we have coming up next week, which is open to the public. This is on religious particularity and moral universality, subtitled Faith, Reason, and Natural Law. This is our annual JIFRA conference. It will be Tuesday, May 14th and Wednesday, May 15th at Frisk Campus Center, room 301. Frisk Campus Center, room 301. And as those of you who are familiar with the program know, we always use the annual JIFRA conference to honor a distinguished scholar. And this year we'll be honoring the great ethicist and scholar of Jewish law, Rabbi David Novak of the University of Toronto. So again, Tuesday, May 14th and Wednesday, May 15th, Frisk Campus Center 301, Religious Particularity and Moral Universality, Faith, Reason, and Natural Law. This lecture was endowed by my beloved friend, the great Boston lawyer Herbert W. Vaughan, Wiley Vaughan as we knew him. Wiley was also known as the man who built the Boston skyline. He was the lawyer who supervised all of the legal work on great buildings such as the Prudential Tower and the John Hancock building in Boston, many others as well. He was also a person who was profoundly interested in issues of moral and political philosophy, and especially constitutional law. In the deed of gift for the endowment for this lecture, he specified that the director of the Madison program, which I have the honor to be, should read a statement of his. He died a few years ago, but should read a statement of his, which I will now read. I, Herbert W. Vaughan, have endowed this lecture at Princeton University to promote and advance understanding of the founding principles and core doctrines of American constitutionalism. What Alexander Hamilton said to the Americans of his day remains true for Americans of every generation. And here he quotes Federalist 1, quote, "It seems to have been reserved to the people of this country by their conduct and example to decide the important question whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend on their political constitutions, for their political constitutions on accident and force," unquote. And then Mr. Vaughan, back in his own voice, says, "In my judgment, the Constitution of the United States is the greatest practical achievement of political science. It's a testament to the extraordinary gifts of creativity, prudence, and high-mindedness possessed by the founders of our nation. May you be guided and inspired by their genius as you meet the challenges of the present day." And with the express permission of Mr. Vaughan, we ask to be able to interpret the terms of the lecture broadly to include discussion and reflection on the great traditions of thought that fed the American founding, the great traditions of moral and political reflection from Athens and Jerusalem. So I now have the pleasure of introducing my great friend, Adrian Vermeule. Adrian is one of the most brilliant and creative, original thinkers working in philosophy of law and political philosophy. Today I've had the pleasure of teaching twice with Adrian at Harvard, and it's just such a treat. He's the Ralph Tyler Professor of Constitutional Law at Harvard Law School. Before joining the faculty at Harvard, he was the Bernard D. Meltzer Professor of Law at the University of Chicago. He's the author or co-author of 9 books, including, this is a book titled Law's Abnegation, From Law's Empire to the Administrative State, as well as The Constitution of Risk and The System of the Constitution. He was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2012, but subsequently resigned in protest of the Academy's political biases. His research focuses on administrative law, the administrative state, the design of institutions, and constitutional theory. He's a graduate of Harvard College and received his law degree from Harvard Law School. Please join me in welcoming Adrian Vermeule.
Thank you so much, Robbie. It's been an enormous pleasure for me to teach with Robbie the past 2 years, illuminating every time, and he's such a kind friend to invite me here. I was hoping actually to be deplatformed. I told Brad Wilson at dinner last night that I feel I'm one of the few people who hasn't been deplatformed, and all the cool kids are doing it. But this is probably the wrong campus for that. So, yeah, right. But so thank you for having me. My topic today is the political, theological, and even liturgical dimensions of liberalism, a concept I'll shortly define. The motto for the talk is Cardinal Henry Edward Manning's dictum that all human conflict is ultimately theological. And the central thought I will advance is that liberal rulers systematically tend to undermine their own rule, and in this sense behave irrationally in an instrumental rationality sense, although not in a value rationality sense. And I insist on this distinction because I don't think it's been brought out adequately in recent debates. Liberal rulers are compelled by the peculiarly dynamic character of their faith and its accompanying sacramental liturgy to violate a central precept of the natural art of politics, the Ragion de Stato, the great tradition of Catholic reaction to Machiavellianism. And the precept I refer to is to not unnecessarily disrupt the traditions, mores, and life ways of the broad mass of the population, or where those traditions must be disrupted in substance, at least to preserve the outward forms of tradition. Liberalism, in my view, is incapable of respecting this constraint because to do so would betray its inner nature, which is to publicly and conspicuously celebrate its great liturgy, the dynamic overcoming of the unfreedom of the past. If this is right, then the dynamism of liberalism is structural and it's not contingent. It constantly disrupts deeply cherished traditions among its subject populations, stirring unrest, animosity, and eventually political reaction and backlash, expressed through the electoral process in democratic polities. Put in terms familiar at the University of Chicago, in whose dark foundries I was apprenticed as a very young boy, liberal rule stands upon a sacramental political theology that creates a problem of incentive incompatibility. I also believe, and this is the part where my evidence will be at best stylized and at worst woefully underdeveloped, that this mechanism I identify accounts for some important share of the increasing conflicts between liberalism and various populist democratic forces and movements in recent years. I'll offer some stylized episodes as examples, but my main aim really is just to suggest a mechanism, not a social scientific law. It's to show a causal process by which liberalism's departures from the benchmark of political prudence supplied by Ragion de Stato result from the distinctive character of its sacramental commitments. So, one must have a definition, especially for the professional academics in the audience. So what is liberalism? We have to distinguish liberalism as a theory in the history of political thought from liberalism as a regime in actually existing societies. I think this is a crucial distinction, often ignored. In the latter sense, liberalism is a concrete type of political theological order that we can study sociologically in anthropology. And the theory and the regime are related, but they're only related. That is, the relationships between them are complicated and contingent. I take liberalism as theory to be a family of doctrines, of which theological, political, and economic liberalism are the main branches. All of these descend from a common ancestor, what Gerald Gauss calls the fundamental principle of liberty, the master commitment to the autonomy of the individual's reason and desires. For many, but not all liberals, this implies that the main aim of political action must be an ever greater liberation of human capacities from the constraints, political, social, economic, even biological, that hamper the maximum fulfillment of that autonomy, consistent with a like fulfillment for all. But liberalism as theory isn't my interest here, let alone the recondite versions of that theory worked out to the nth decimal with distinctions among perfectionist and anti-perfectionist liberalism and so forth. I will be impatient with complaints that I have not spoken to the latest paper on Rawlsianism in the Boston Review, although it turns out I will in fact speak to the latest paper on Rawlsianism in the Boston Review, but okay. I mean to focus in sociological vein on what I call sacramental liberalism as a lived and very concrete type of political theological order. So let me explain. Liberal orders have spread around the globe, but they are no longer as dominant as they were in their heyday after World War II. The majority of humanity has probably always lived under non-liberal forms of government, but recent decades have seen a distinct recession of the liberal tide, especially in Eastern Europe, Latin America, and Asia. These orders typically feature a similar array of institutions, including electoral institutions that select among elites competing for leadership in Schumpeterian fashion, some version of market economies more or less constrained by regulation and redistributive taxation. They feature a similar array of public commitments and official rhetoric, public secularism, a rhetoric of the marketplace of ideas within sharply defined limits, sexual permissiveness, tolerance except of the intolerant, and aggressive attempts to police non-liberal forces externally and sometimes internally. Liberalism is also pervasively and I believe essentially sacramental, and this is the dimension I want to bring out especially. It has a critical dimension of political theology, and the behavior of liberal agents often can't be adequately understood without this lens. Liberalism on this view is best understood as an imperfectly secularized offshoot of Christianity, whose main features are not only the notorious immanentist hypostasis of the eschaton, but an odd and distinctive mix of Pelagianism and Gnosticism that I think was beautifully addressed in a recent Vatican document called Placuit Deo. In this sense, liberalism as a lived faith centers around an anti-liturgy that I've called the Festival of Reason, the founding moment of modernity. This is the moment when the goddess of reason was installed in place of the Virgin Mary on the holy altar of Notre Dame in Paris in 1793. The Festival of Reason celebrates and recapitulates in ever novel guises the dawning of rational freedom and the overcoming of the darkness, superstition, and slavish authoritarianism of the irrational past. This is a benchmark that necessarily changes with each celebration of the liturgy, requiring new enemies to play the part of the villain. The essential components of the festival are twofold: the irreversibility of progress and the victory over the forces of reaction. And taken in combination, these commitments give liberalism its restless and aggressive dynamism. The Festival of Reason has to disrupt settled equilibria of peace, security, customs, norms, tradition, in order to fulfill its self-expression as an overcoming of entrenched irrational structures of oppression and obscurantism. I think only this political theological account explains so many concrete puzzles of lived experience within a liberal order. Why, for example, is it possible to encounter people, even intellectuals of high intelligence, who say things like, "I'm working for change," as though change in and of itself is good? By the same token, why are the canonized saints of liberalism invariably agents who have produced social or political change rather than those who have, say, fended off bad change? Where the celebration of disruption, the shattering and overcoming of the past, is itself the sacramental compulsion, however, this fundamental asymmetry is no longer puzzling. Working for change is value rational action, whether or not it is instrumentally rational action. Another puzzle involves the fact that the liberal imagination has an ever-receding time horizon. Whatever the question, the good liberal says, we've made some progress, but there's a long way to go. But of course, even after more progress is made, the goal never seems to have come any closer. If the real aim is always to create a justification for fresh and ever-repeated celebrations of the festival, however, this receding horizon makes perfect sense. It's exactly the precondition for the indefinite repetition of the liturgy. A final puzzle, one I've touched on elsewhere: why do liberal institutions and intellectuals react so much more aggressively to Poland, Hungary, and Brexit than they do to Saudi Arabia or China? This should be deeply puzzling. The latter must be far worse on any measurable dimensions of interest to liberalism. The only answer is that the first group embodies for liberalism the horror of retrogression, which profoundly threatens the soteriology of continual progress. In general, one of the features, I think, of living in an order of this sort is a disconnect between the official rhetoric of secularism and a depoliticized public sphere on the one hand, and the concrete experience of life within liberal regimes. The furious passion of the urban bourgeoisie, the Saturday political marches that seem in some obvious way an act of communal worship, or at least a substitute for communal worship, the denunciations of politicians and corporate executives and celebrities for the grave sin of believing last year what everyone else believed last year, the abject confessions and repentance of those figures, the signs testifying that, and this is a real sign from a recent political demonstration, Beto is our Christ. The disconnect arises because liberalism as an official theory denies or at least downplays its own political theological commitments. This theoretical denial is, however, ultimately untenable because as a lived sacramental regime, it destabilizes the conditions for its own persistence. The theory and the regime are chronically, not merely contingently, out of sync. Well, there's one final preliminary issue. Should we make a distinction here between liberalism and so-called progressivism? And this is an issue of interest to many where the wise path, the kind of prudent path would be for me to say that I don't need to speak to it, but as a slight digression, I'm going to tell you what I think is the truth. And I think the truth is that there is no such distinction in the following sense. Historically speaking, progressivism is an offshoot of liberalism, but it's not as though it's a betrayal or a distortion of it, or as though one could return to a liberalism that doesn't give rise to progressivism. Progressivism is the child and true heir of liberalism. It's purified and logically consistent expression. Progressivism is what happens when the festival of reason has overcome the most obvious villains, when the monarchs have been deposed and the priests have been slaughtered, and then one looks for new villains to play their assigned part in the great liturgy. Progressivism is what happens when one follows the logic of human liberation to its end point, overriding all the culturally contingent limitations and shaky conceptual barriers, like the public-private distinction and the distinction between state organs and the corporate form, distinctions that progressives like Robert Hale, in my view, showed to be intellectually untenable. When the arch-progressive John Dewey speaks in grandiloquent tones of great movements for human liberation, it's because he takes himself to be carrying out the liberal project, not hijacking or betraying it. My friend Gladden Papin has a nice quote here. He says, although some speak of the progressive movement as a corruption of liberalism, it's a natural, even correct outgrowth of the liberal achievement in a democratic context to be concerned with identifying and expanding the preconditions of liberty, health, security, safety, etc. And this expansion was precisely what the progressives attempted to bring about. Now, this is a very large conversation. I'm happy to bracket it for those who disagree, but I did want to just offer one central proof of concept case. If anyone can be firmly classified as an Anglo-American liberal, it's John Stuart Mill. And if anyone counts as a paradigmatic progressive theorist, the kind of terror of the campus, it's Herbert Marcuse. But it turns out that Marcuse is a Millian. He explicitly takes himself to be carrying Mill's project to its logical conclusion. How is this possible? Well, Mill notoriously accepted barbarians from his general scheme of liberal arrangements. He argued that barbarians, like children, lack full maturity of their faculties and thus lack the capacity to participate in a liberal order. Despotism, wrote Mill, is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians, provided the end be their improvement and the means justified by actually effecting that end. Liberty as a principle has no application to any state of things anterior to the time when mankind have become capable of being improved by free and equal discussion. Until then, there's nothing for them but implicit obedience to an Akbar or a Charlemagne, if they are so fortunate as to find one. And Marcuse explicitly takes up this point and pursues this logic of preconditions to its consistent endpoint, arguing that even in advanced liberal democracies, there are many who fit this description. There are many barbarians in Marcuse's view. The view holds that background conditions in society, disparities of wealth, failures of public education, and other forms of unequal power may infantilize the faculties and distort or cripple the rationality of almost everyone, apart from what Marcuse sees as a ruling elite who enjoy genuine intellectual autonomy. This is, in a deep sense, authentically Millian in spirit. It's exactly why Mill wanted to give extra votes to the highly educated. Marcuse has a different remedy. Given the background structures and conditions of intellectual heteronomy, what he sees as true liberation and what he calls a faithful execution of the Millian project requires dispossessing the knowledge monopolists of their power, precisely so that the preconditions for a wider liberation of humanity can be brought into being. The problem is, and this is Marcuse, to create a society in which man is no longer enslaved by institutions which vitiate self-determination from the beginning. Freedom is still to be created even for the freest of the existing societies. And he continues, in Mill, every rational human being participates in the discussion and decision, but only as a rational being, and only the rational beings do so. Where society has entered the phase of total administration and indoctrination, this would be a small number indeed, and not necessarily that of the elected representatives of the people. The problem is not that of an educational dictatorship, but that of breaking the tyranny of public opinion. So when Marcuse speaks of repressive tolerance, he doesn't mean to condemn it, as though he were writing a critique of campus radicals, although his phrase is often twisted to that use. Rather, Marcuse is condemning the repressive tolerance of the status quo of free speech conservatism, this is his outlook, in which radical movements for liberation of humanity from oppression are constrained by the false tolerance of the marketplace of ideas. And he's praising a new form of repressive tolerance that will repress the forces that block the enterprise of liberation. And he calls this good form of repressive tolerance liberating tolerance, precisely because liberation requires repression of the forces that would otherwise exploit background conditions of power, wealth, for example, to constrain the behavior and even the thought of the oppressed. It follows from Marcuse that the restoration of freedom of thought may necessitate new and rigid restrictions on teachings and practices in the educational institutions, by which their very methods and concepts serve to enclose the mind within the established universe and discourse. Now, I don't mean to endorse any of this. That's not my point. My point is that everything the Millian here finds objectionable about progressive tyranny on campus is argued by Marcuse to flow precisely from a thoroughgoing execution of the Millian project. And I think it is incumbent upon those who would distinguish liberalism from progressivism to show where Marcuse goes wrong. Well, as I said, that's a bit of a digression and not essential to the main thrust of my argument. I'm now in position to turn to my core claim, which is that liberalism, sacramental dynamism, tends to undermine itself by violating the natural principles of rule embodied in the Ragion de Stato tradition. So this tradition tries to elaborate principles by which a ruler could secure the famous threefold hallmarks of the common good, which it refers to as abundance, peace, and justice. By doing so, the ruler could secure what Giovanni Botero called firm rule over people and used as a definition of the state. The Ragion de Stato tradition is essential here because it focuses us on the equilibrium conditions for rule, that is, the conditions under which rule will be self-sustaining and incentive-compatible, or will instead undermine the conditions for its own continuation. Botero urges the ruler to adopt a stance of great prudential caution about disrupting the mores, traditions, and life ways of the people. He writes, "Nothing is more hateful in governments than to change things which have acquired esteem through their antiquity," whereby hateful Botero means hated by the mass of the ruled. Crucially, the issue isn't only change, but the rate of change, and whether change is public and conspicuous, especially involving the change of names and titles. Botero writes, "Do not make sudden changes because such actions have something of the violent, and violence rarely succeeds. Charles Martel, aspiring to become King of France, did not want as major domo of the king suddenly to usurp the title of king, but took the title of prince of the French nobility. His son Pepin then easily obtained the title of king and the kingdom. The Caesars, from perpetual dictators, that's of course not our modern sense, became tribunes, then princes, and finally emperors and absolute masters." Well, as the last sentence shows, the great example of prudence on this dimension for Botero and throughout the Ragion de Stato literature is, of course, Octavian, who, as Augustus, adopted the titles and forms of the Republican Constitution. In Macaulay's famous description, the Caesars ruled despotically by means of a great standing army under the decent forms of a Republican Constitution. Yet they could safely indulge in the wildest freaks of cruelty and rapacity while their legions remained faithful. So there are two distinct issues here, that is preserving traditional practices and preserving traditional forms. And that Botero believes that it's imperative to try to minimize disruption to both, and that where disruption must occur, it should be effected gradually if at all possible. He writes, "If rulers have to make changes, it's necessary that they proceed little by little and, as it were, imperceptibly, imitating nature, which does not move directly from winter to summer nor from summer to winter, but places two temperate seasons between them." Well, why exactly are these councils of imprudence so important for the Ragion de Stato? Why do populations react so badly to the ruler's disruption of traditional practices? And why, even more puzzlingly, do they focus at least as much on forms, titles, and names as they do on actual behavior and the actual power of offices? Machiavelli gives us a typically highly quotable yet nearly tautological explanation. He says the generality of men feed on what appears as much as on what is, and are more moved by things that appear than by things that are. But this doesn't explain the phenomenon. This is just a restatement of it. I think Botero's emphasis suggests at least a better explanation, and here I draw on modern positive political theory models of rebellion against an incumbent ruler. So let me explain. In these models, we have a silent, currently unorganized supermajority that's passive due to coordination problems. So we have, let's say, two groups in the population that could together overthrow the ruler if they could coordinate, and their problem is to overcome the ruler's divide and conquer position as incumbent. What's necessary for this widespread coordination to occur is what the game theorists call a focal point, a salient point, such that it becomes common knowledge among the ruled that a line has been crossed. How exactly large groups converge on focal points is too circumstantial and case-specific to generalize about very much, but it's very plausible that flagrant violations of traditional norms often amount to focal points of this sort. And because names and titles are the least costly for the public to observe, this theory explains why change of names and forms are especially likely to serve as focal points. It's much easier to observe whether Caesar accepts a crown in the name of Rex on a salient occasion in the Forum than it is to observe the quotidian use Octavian makes of the tribunician power. So on this view, Botero's advice to proceed through gradual discrete change that respects forms and names is best understood as advice to the ruler not to commit actions that transgress highly visible focal points and thereby trigger coordination among the public. All right, I can now complete my thesis. There's a standing structural tension between sacramental liberalism and the basic principles of Ragion de Stato we've been examining. Politics in existing liberal regimes feature a continual dynamism, a continual creative destruction of tradition that undermines and disrupts pre-existing practices among the populace. This dynamic changes itself the steady state. Sacramental liberalism requires not merely an overcoming of the darkness of pre-rational tradition, but, and this is the crucial part, an explicit, public, visible overcoming. The community must see that the forces of reaction have been vanquished, and they must see that the vanquished see that, and so on. So the triumph of liberty and the defeat of the darkness of the past has to be common knowledge. The consequence is that it's inconsistent with the whole essence and point of sacramental liberalism to follow this fundamental precept of Ragion de Stato to respect even the names and forms of tradition, let alone its substantive practices. It's not that this is an iron necessity, it's a causal mechanism. It's a description of a causal process that explains or illuminates, I think, certain cases or episodes without purporting to supply necessary and sufficient conditions for predicting when the causal process will or will not occur. It occupies the space of what I would call structural propensity, lying between, distinct from the simple modal categories of either necessity and contingency. Unfortunately for liberal rulers, the disrupted, the subjects of sacramental liberalism, have their own views. Where liberalism has made an uneasy alliance with democracies, it did to varying degrees during the 19th and 20th century, those views are expressed through electoral backlash. Let me offer a few stylized examples of this backlash process. First, I have a pair of puzzles from the crucial period 2014 to 2016 in American politics, when the tempo of sacramental liberalism increased sharply. In both cases, the puzzle is that political incumbents, executive actors in one case, judicial actors in another, took actions that were flagrantly ill-advised from the standpoint of the Ragion de Stato, revealing deeper sacramental commitments and impulses, so value rational but not instrumentally rational. The first was the Obama administration's relentless attempt to force the Little Sisters of the Poor to either fund abortifacient contraceptives or at least to take action to pass the responsibility for doing so elsewhere. I remember vividly commentators at the time criticizing the seemingly inexplicable stupidity of the administration's approach, which created a highly salient example of repressive regulatory liberalism, secular liberalism, and thus radically antagonized Christian conservatives who proceeded to vote for Trump in large numbers. It's plausible to think there's a causal connection between those two, although it's hard to pin that down one way or another. But the commentator's criticism, while entirely valid from a Ragion de Stato perspective, I don't think reached the root of the matter, because I don't think it understood the value-rational logic of what the Obama administration was doing. The point of the administration's conduct, in my view, was not only to force one smallish order of nuns to provide contraceptives. Indeed, the very fact that the administration offered a voluntary opt-out conditional on merely making a few bureaucratic affirmations underscores that the real objective lay elsewhere. Rather, the objective was, in my view, ceremonial. It was to force the nuns to publicly acknowledge the liberal state's just authority over the subject matter, the authority to require either provision of contraceptives or the exercise of an opt-out as the state saw fit. The main point, then, was to stage a public, sacramental celebration of the justice of liberal power acknowledged by its very targets and subjects. Another example involves the puzzle of Obergefell, the same-sex marriage decision. And I include here the administration's representation at oral argument in the Supreme Court that institutions not supportive of same-sex marriage might have to lose their tax exemptions as contrary to public policy. The puzzle is not only why the administration would make such an inflammatory threat, but also why a judicial decision was necessary at all when the tide of politics was running in favor of same-sex marriage anyway. Simple non-intervention by means of any of the standard techniques described by Alexander Bickel and available to the liberal justices would have attained the same policy ends or consequences with no decision at all. As far as instrumental political rationality went, all that was necessary was to do nothing, and one's goals would be achieved. But a conspicuous judicial conflict with the settled mores of millennia was, of course, the very point of the exercise. From the liberal standpoint, it was right and just to have same-sex marriage not merely embodied in law, but declared a requirement of constitutional justice, coupled with a conspicuous defeat of the forces of reaction. Obergefell's radical and public dismissal of tradition as unreasoned prejudice and animus, which certainly contributed to evangelical support for Trump was no contingent mistake that the liberal order might have corrected by better appreciation of the Ragion de Stato. The dynamic sacramental commitments of liberalism are here illuminated precisely because it departs from the prudential benchmark of caution about the disruption of tradition. So far, I've mentioned examples from the sphere of marriage and the family. It's important to emphasize that that the ideology of free market economics is as pervasively sacramental as our social expressions of liberalism. The celebration of creative destruction is just the festival of reason, festooned with citations to Austrian economists, or in a form of hard obscurantism with equations. I've argued elsewhere, and I won't recapitulate the argument here, the claim that the invisible hand of the market will indirectly conduce to human goods is an imperfectly secularized notion that, having rejected its own underpinnings in providentialist political theology, inevitably degenerates into fideism without adequate evidence. The relentless celebration of disruption in the name of liberation, disruption of local industries, thick communities and their ways of life, has, without question, I believe, been instrumentally irrational, even from the standpoint of the masters of the economy. It's been a cause of widespread resentment and destabilizing political backlash, as many have observed. Well, I'm almost done. I want to conclude by eliciting a crucial assumption in the foregoing discussion. Consider the cases in which the backlash generated by sacramental liberalism is expressed through democratic means, in which liberal parties begin to lose elections and hence their grip on power. There is an obvious way that liberal incumbents may react to this effect, which is to constrain the institutions of democracy itself. This is not to say, of course, that they can entirely escape the force of public opinion, but it's possible within limits to slow the translation of hostile public opinion into formal legal and political power. And indeed, in recent years, we have seen precisely this in case after case. Let me briefly mention some of the observable instances. Repeated votes and vote nullification. So sometimes liberal incumbents are forced by public opinion to grant a referendum vote on the validity of liberal policies, or else they seek democratic legitimation by doing so. If they miscalculate badly, as did the major party leaders with the Brexit referendum in 2016, never fear. One can perhaps force the people to vote again until the right result is reached. This remains a serious possibility in the Brexit debates, and just yesterday, politically critical Tories came out and said that the only way forward is to have a second vote. The reason this would be the only way forward, of course, is that both incumbent parties were never fundamentally committed to Brexit in the first place. The main liberal tactic deployed after the Brexit referendum, however, was kind of open-ended, indefinite talk. The endless conversation of liberalism here becomes a concrete means of sidestepping and thwarting a particular focused democratic vote at a given place in time. Sometimes one may simply ignore and nullify the result of the vote de facto after a long period of conversation. So this happened when French and Dutch voters rejected the proposed new constitution for the European Union in 2005. Many of the important provisions were then adopted intergovernmentally in the Treaty of Lisbon in 2009 through a process that involved no referenda at all. Another major tactic is the so-called cordon sanitaire. The cordon sanitaire is a norm that holds between liberal parliamentary parties, whether the social liberal left or the economically liberal right. And the norm holds that it is incumbent on these parties to enter into a cross-party coalition in an attempt to keep out of office parties who deviate from the liberal consensus on critical issues, such as, in the European context, immigration. So powerful is the intraliberal norm of the cordon sanitaire that it can, in some cases, even override immediate political self-interest. So liberal parties in Germany refused to cooperate with the AfD party that desired immigration restrictions even though any of the main liberal parties could have formed a government in alliance with AfD. When the liberal parties cannot themselves form a majority in combination but can prevent anyone else from doing so, this can lead to extraordinary delays in forming governments. This occurred recently in both Germany and Sweden. The cordon sanitaire is to politics as collusion by firms with market power to block entry by competitors is to antitrust law. Now, these tactics, of course, carry their own risks. They may simply exacerbate the backlash when it comes, and we've seen that in particular cases as well. Here, too, it's plausible to think that liberal parties are deciding without regard to the ordinary benchmarks of instrumental political rationality. Were the German parties, for example, to include AfD in parliamentary coalitions adopting compromise proposals, it is plausible to think, and many argued, that AfD would be domesticated and the public demand that fuels it would be dampened. The reason liberal parties refuse to do so is a dynamic of purity and contamination, the fear of association with the heretic. I believe that there is ultimately no escape from this dynamic, and that liberalism cannot ultimately escape its systematic conflict with natural principles of rule. I believe that sooner or later, perhaps in our lifetimes, liberal democratic orders will become systematically and increasingly undemocratic in order to remain liberal. And at that point, their long-term sustainability comes into serious question. Let me finish with a quotation. No political system can survive even a generation with only naked techniques of holding power. To the political belongs the idea because there's no politics without authority and no authority without an ethos of belief. Liberalism's dilemma is that its paradoxically anti-authoritarian sacramental ethos, its compulsion to celebrate the overcoming of unfreedom, oppression, and hierarchy, is ultimately consistent with straightforward prudential principles of rulership, and in that sense undermines its own incumbency. Or so I claim. Thank you.
Q&A? Very good. All right, time for Q&A. Let's see if any students would like to begin the discussion. If not, we'll open the floor to everyone. But students are also allowed to join in once
later on.
Others get the thing going. Yeah, Professor Tarr. Do we have microphones for the video? No, we don't. Chanel, just speak up, Alan. Yeah.
Sure.
First of all, I very much enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
I wonder, though, that the example use of Obergefell could likewise be used for Brown with the Board of Education, which was likewise significantly disruptive. What's the difference, if any?
Well, I have nothing at stake in there being a difference. That is, the point isn't that these decisions are bad, you understand. The point is that they are disruptive, and they're made on grounds other than instrumental political rationality. I actually think Brown is a great example of this, that in some ways cemented Republican dominance of the South for many decades. Now, this is not, there's many complications here, and the legal historians and political scientists have a lot to say, but let me just clarify, I hope anyone didn't take away, the point wasn't normative. The point was about incentive compatibility. That is, repeatedly, routinely, making sacramentalized decisions without regard to instrumental political rationality tends to undermine one's own rule by inducing backlash. Now, from a normative standpoint, it may be that the things disrupted needed to be disrupted. It may be that the things disrupted didn't need to be disrupted. So my own normative views are that that Brown was good, and that the Little Sisters of the Poor example was terrible. But those questions are orthogonal to the causal mechanism that I've put forward.
Yes, Professor Stern.
Thank you so much for your comments. So the area that you're most well known in the legal world is administrative law in the public law. And I was trying to think of, to what extent does your account of liberalism take into account, or what does it think of administrative agencies? Because one could see prima facie that they seem to arise at the same time as the progressive movement in the United States, that one characterization of administrative agencies is that they tend to be instruments of change and also then instruments to prevent retrogression, one of the characteristics you identified. So what are your thoughts about the relationship between liberalism and the administrative state?
Yeah, so a couple things. I think it's very important not to be too parochial here. In kind of historical and comparative perspective, there is no structural kind of intrinsic connection between bureaucracy and liberalism. As an undergraduate, I studied the formation of the Chinese bureaucratic state in the 3rd century BC and its justification by a man named Master Han Fei, who was not at all liberal, to say the least. So that although in particular liberal polities, it may be true that bureaucracy is put to liberal ends, that's just a feature of the commitments of the polity, not of anything else. And it's certainly possible to have bureaucracy that does other things. Now, I do think it's true that bureaucracy amplifies the power of the incumbents and their commitments, whatever those commitments may be. My aim as a public law scholar has been to critique legal liberalism, and that's been the kind of master theme of my work, to the extent one can retrospectively create coherence. But if you look at a book called The Executive Unbound and The Constitution of Risk, you'll see me go on about this endlessly. To the extent that legal liberalism is undermined, it wouldn't be an undermining of the bureaucratic apparatus. It would be a suggestion that it should be put to different purposes.
Yes, up here.
I was just curious, could you say more about this importance of the specifically liturgical character, as opposed to just say, this being a strong commitment or belief on the part of liberals or something that leads them?
Yeah, I think there are well-known debates which I won't rehearse, and that people in this room understand far better than I do about what counts as religion, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions, or is the whole inquiry into necessary and sufficient conditions misguided and we just have family resemblance complexes and so on. My point is that there is something about liberalism that is fundamentally ceremonial and that is best processed by us through analogies to religious liturgy and religious sacrament. And part of the ceremonial character of liberalism, or the two parts of it, are value rational action that should be common knowledge. That is, it should be a focused ceremonial moment in which a self-expression of commitments occurs and is common knowledge to all the participants, seen by them, seen to be seen by them, and so forth. And those are the fundamental features that make it, I think, structurally inconsistent with Botero's counsel. But what Botero argues that if you must, disrupt, do it in a low visibility way. And it's that counsel that sacramental liberalism can't follow structurally.
Yes, sir.
I have two questions. I enjoyed the talk. I thought it was very interesting. My first question is, critiques of liberalism are kind of as old as liberalism itself. And so you're arguing in a tradition that feels like pretty familiar, including the claim that liberalism is at war with itself. And I'm wondering what you make of that. Like, how do you position your own argument in that tradition? What's new? Is there something special about this moment that brings this kind of argument to the surface for you, or what exactly is happening?
Let me just do that one first. In and then go on to the second one. Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think that I'm trying to be a bit delicate here because I have to say something slightly critical about work that I very much admire. Work like Pat Deneen's recent book. I think what this work has not adequately taken into account is the political theological dimension of liberalism. There is nothing about this in Deneen's book, or there are scattered hints, but they're never assembled into a coherent frame. And I think that until one understands this component, which I've just spent 45 minutes talking about and won't recapitulate, one can't understand the self-undermining dynamic of liberalism and its relationship to the prudential baseline set by the Ragion de Stato. So I do think that's the contribution I want to make. But sorry, I interrupted. What was your second question?
The second one is kind of related, which is, one of the defenses of liberalism, of course, is that it's sort of the least bad alternative, right? So it's true that there are these tensions within the system of political thought or even theological thought.
Yeah.
But the alternatives are much worse. So I wonder, what do you view as the alternative?
Well, again, I want to be misunderstood. This argument I've just given you is not about the best regime, not even about the best regime relative to constraints. It's about the incentive compatibility of liberalism. That is, the right frame for locating the argument is ought implies can. That is, if there is some kind of causal dynamic that results in the self-undermining of liberal orders, then our normative theories, however interesting they may be, are neither here nor there. And I think that there is a massive fact we need to explain just out there in the world, which is that in the past couple decades, especially in the past decade, we have seen a global kind of wave of backlash against liberal orders expressed often through the democratic components of those orders. That's a fact that needs to be grappled with, and that's what I'm trying to grapple with. So for me, the kind of normative political theory is secondary to that. I'll just say very briefly that the idea that liberalism is the least bad alternative I think depends on one's normative commitments. For me, it's not the least bad alternative because it blocks the public sphere from addressing things I think public sphere needs to address. But that's a whole other conversation.
Dr. Thomas, was your hand up? Yeah.
Sir.
Is liberalism really in having this, what you call, incentive compatibility problem with Ragion de Stato? I mean, it seems like any strong political movement is going to row up against this deference to tradition and custom. It's going to have some claim to justice, right, that's going to rub up against this prudential, right, deference to leaving things as they are that you cannot change right now. Is liberalism unique in having that problem?
It is unique in the sense that there's no, one can have a conception of justice that itself builds in that respect for the traditions, mores, and folkways of the peoples itself, at least a component of justice and perhaps maybe the core of justice. And there have historically, in the history of political thought, been a number of conceptions like that. So what is, I think, peculiar to liberalism is this sense, which I feel strongly in a pre-theoretical way is just kind of observably true, this sense of the celebration of overcoming of the past. And we see this over and over again at crucial moments in the kind of history of the growth of liberalism as a regime in Europe. This sense of that there is an entrenched, oppressive, obscurantist past that needs to be shattered. We see it in 1793. We see it in 1848. We see it in 1870 in Rome. And I think there's something there that is a structural feature of liberalism and that makes it unique.
Dr. Pinkoski?
Yes, thank you.
Sure,
I want
yeah.
to probe you a bit more on the distinction between liberalism and democracy. And let me explain why a little bit and then see what you have to say. My thought is that a lot of critiques of liberalism work on this dynamic and then end up with an elevation of democracy vis-a-vis liberalism, like an elevation of the people versus liberalism. It strikes me, though, that you are using as your point of origin for modernity a moment where you associate liberalism with the Jacobin impulse. But we also see the notion of the people, or the notion of how the people is expressed nowadays within the format of the nation state, is something that is itself created at that moment. So that we might say the dynamic of liberalism is one that produces democracy as an alternative. So the debate between liberalism versus democracy is itself a creation of liberalism.
Yeah, I think that's a historical contingency. So I have if you're interested in this, I have a paper called Liberalism's Fear about the relationship between liberalism and democracy. And I'm here following an account, not my own, but the account goes the following way, that in 1789, one has, in the 1793, one has a contingent alliance between liberal and democratic forces vis-a-vis a crown and aristocracy, which are neither liberal nor democratic. And that in those circumstances, one can coherently speak about liberal democracy as a political force over and against those. The problem arises in the 19th century, especially after 1848, when we have increasingly democratic orders that pose a problem for the role of liberals within the democratic order. And that's when the alliance starts to come apart and we have increasing tensions between them. And we have a series of political tactics pursued by liberals to try to either maintain the alliance in working order or to try to kind of dampen the conflict. And part of what's happened, I think, in Europe in the past period, however we want to define that period, is that the alliance has increasingly come unglued and been destabilized.
Professor Conte?
Thanks. I guess the kind of examples you give that you think highlight the especially sacramental character of liberalism are social or cultural liberalism today. And I think a lot of the people engaged in, particularly invested in that kind of liberalism, do not care about legal or economic liberalism. And I don't see Ocasio-Cortez, for example, celebrating features of legal or economic liberalism, even as I think she's especially sacramental figure on these social and cultural questions. And I'm just wondering what you make of that. I mean, it doesn't seem to me that the things that you see as highlighting the theological character of liberalism today are traveling as a package with all of the beliefs and views that went together in the liberal order.
Yeah, nor did I say they have to. I mean, I said liberalism is a family with different branches, and just like any family, they can sometimes be working in tandem or sometimes be working at cross purposes. What gives them dissent from a common principle is this commitment to autonomy. But it's familiar that different branches of the liberal clan pursue this commitment in different spheres, some in the social and sexual sphere, some in the economic sphere, some in the theological sphere, and that these can sometimes work at cross purposes to one another. So it's no part of my account that liberalism is all one thing. It's not. Yeah.
I'd like to stay on this for a minute and jump
Please,
into
yeah.
it. So Greg, join in this. So Adrian, what you got me thinking about is the question, what is contingent and what is necessary in liberal ideas about politics and principles and policy.
Yeah.
We tend, and I have tended, to think that what makes something liberal is the content of a particular position. This is the liberal view of this. That's the conservative view of this, or the libertarian or the socialist view of this. But now you've got me wondering, maybe that's not right.
Yeah.
So, take a couple of examples. The liberal or progressive movement got to anti-racism and desegregation, got there ahead of the conservative movement, considered as an organized political movement, but it still got there late. Early progressives were racists.
Right.
The name Woodrow Wilson might be familiar to you here at Princeton.
I'm staying out of this one.
Scientific
Yeah.
racism was not something that came out of rootedness in tradition.
Right.
Right? Those were progressive ideas. And then when we turn to eugenics, the liberal or progressive movement got there early
Right.
and stuck. As I've pointed out back to the race issue, if you take the Japanese internment cases, the Korematsu decision and its companions, you find who behind the movement to intern the Japanese and to justify it in American law. You find Earl Warren, Attorney General of California, leading progressive figure,
Yeah.
calling for the internment. You find Franklin Delano Roosevelt accepting the call and putting through the policy through his Congress, which had been overwhelmingly voted into office on his coattails. And then when the issue gets to the Supreme Court, you have his three leading justices, the three progressive leading justices on the court, Hugo Black, William O. Douglas, and Felix Frankfurter, voting to uphold the constitutionality of the internment. And who's against it? Frank Murphy happened to be a Roosevelt appointee. But what's interesting about Frank Murphy, or his opinion, for those of you who know it, some of my students will know this. He occupied the Catholic seat and appealed to natural law as his argument for what was fundamentally unjust against the internment. It also happens that another major important figure that opposed the internment was J. Edgar Hoover. History's odd, isn't it? Really fun. You wouldn't, right? So what all that makes me wonder is, were these policy positions and principles arrived at by liberalism because there's something in liberal theory that took you there, and even if it took a while to get there, they got there? Or are they contingent because it's not actually the content of the policy that's driving it?
Exactly.
It's something else. Now, if it is something else, it seems to me that really heavily supports your Sacramental thesis.
Right. That's exactly right, Robbie. Thank you. That's very helpful and insightful. I don't think that liberalism is about first order policies or commitments. I think it's about a commitment to a certain type of justification or structure of justification. And that's this master principle of autonomy. And so one can have policies that have either a liberal justification or an entirely different sort of justification that could perfectly well converge. And that's why, like, if we live in a non-liberal structure of justification, we might observationally have a lot of the same policies that you have in a liberal regime, just justified in a different way.
I think that's just a terribly important point if it's true. I'm
Yeah.
inclined to think that it
Yeah.
is. Just take desegregation for a second.
Right.
Who's marching with Martin Luther King? Well, there's some.
Right.
Just take the black side of that equation.
Yeah.
There are some who would count as progressives theologically,
Right.
like King himself.
Right.
Right. And there are others, like Shuttlesworth
Right.
and
Right.
King's own father,
Right.
who would count as anything but liberals or
Right.
progressives. Take those who, though not black, came to the assistance of King. You had left-wing, progressive, secular students from New York, the Freedom Riders, come down to ride. And who are they marching alongside? The most traditional Catholic nuns in their full
Right.
habits. Or figures like Abraham Joshua Heschel. So
Exactly.
they're on the same side here, but they're not coming from the same place to get there.
Exactly, not the same structure of justification. So if I get a liberal in my sense and a Catholic non-liberal in the same room, and I say, what do you think about racism? They should both say it's bad, but with different structures of justification. The Catholic should be reading Mitbrenender Sorge and pointing, importantly to this revealed structure of the brotherhood of man, and basing their commitments on that. So as
Do
we
you have
said,
anything, Greg, on this? No?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll get that on the table. Yes, Ruby Shaw.
Perhaps drawing on historical examples, what would you say is the kind of backlash that might motivate liberals to sacrifice some value rationality for instrumental rationality, and therefore better respect democratic processes?
Yeah, this is something I haven't. I've tried to think about it, haven't made much progress on, and my self-exculpation is that it's hard to make progress on, and let me explain. We frequently see agents with value rational commitments that have kind of cost overrides. That is, when the instrumentally rational costs of pursuing the value rational commitment exceed some high threshold, then they will temper or even abandon their value rational commitments. And that's a very common structure. It's like a famous example is the institution of the vendetta, where we have the following very funny a combination of things. One is a value rational commitment to revenge, without regard to whether revenge will in the long run make things better for the revenger or the revenger's family. We combine that with exceedingly fine-grained instrumental rationality about how to achieve revenge, so we lie in wait for our target and maneuver subtly in the Sicilian landscape or whatever to try to get at our target. But then the third thing we see is that sometimes the vendetta is in fact just abandoned because people are too scared or too worried about their children getting killed, and this is an example of the same structure. So I don't have well-developed thoughts on that. It's entirely possible. But what it would mean is it would temper the force of this mechanism, but it wouldn't fundamentally undercut it, if that makes sense.
Dr. Smart.
You asked about the administrative state, but
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak to another structural institution of liberalism as we experience it, and that is the institution of separation of powers and checks and balances.
Yeah.
Is it possible to disambiguate these institutional practices from liberalism as you understand it? And if not, why not? Because it seems to me like these institutions that are more traditionally part of civic republicanism could potentially be defended by a theology other than liberalism.
Yeah.
And you could make arguments about a mixed regime best approximating the common good.
Exactly. No, I think this is a great example in the category of Robbie's point about justifications for liberalism, about certain classes of justifications for institutions, not the institutions. And it should be, obvious to us that, when Polybius is kind of originating the discourse about something, it's probably not justified in the same terms that Rawls would give to justify it, right? So that we could have non-liberal justifications for a regime of mixed government, and the whole De Regno is about this in some ways, and incidentally also non-liberal justifications for important elements of democracy within the framework of mixed government. So I think that's absolutely a great example. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I'm disturbed about liberals in states like California, New York, and New Jersey writing laws, their legislators writing laws, and their judges interpreting laws that impact religious belief. And I'm wondering, what effect is this going to have on the rest of the country? These laws are not being challenged except within their own states.
Are you referring to the bill that would break the seal of the confessional? Or
That would be an example.
Yeah,
an
okay.
example.
Okay, an example.
Yeah.
No, he's got the example. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what to say. I mean, I think that, our constitutional framework, the only possible justifications for these are, for opposing these sorts of laws, are either positivism or liberalism. And positivism is, of course, just the autonomy of the lawmaker. So, as people have observed, it has fundamental connections to liberal political justification. But yeah, you can't oppose them on the sort of grounds I would want to oppose them on. Now, there are people who do heroic work kind of arguing within the framework of liberal legalism against such laws, and I have nothing to say other than to commend them.
They've had, I mean, I've been involved with it, should I say.
Yeah.
We've had a string of victories. And the current Supreme Court looks like a favorable one for more victories. The really interesting constitutional question is what the court will do about Oregon against Smith, which was handed down with a, if not a bipartisan, a bi-ideological majority in the early 1990s, which made it more difficult for claimants to win free exercise of religion cases on constitutional grounds. And so things shifted to a federal and then state Religious Freedom Restoration Act statutory grounds. But there's clearly now support, substantial support on the court for overruling Smith. Now I myself, just full disclosure, I myself had said Smith was correct and continue to think Smith was actually correctly decided constitutionally. But I suspect, whether I'm right or wrong about it, I suspect the court is going to revisit it, and it might, in fact, reverse it. And if it reverses it, that's going to significantly strengthen the hand of religious liberty claimants of all traditions. You know, everyone from Native American Indians who are worried about things like photographs on driver's licenses and disruption of ancient burial grounds and things like that, to the Little Sisters of the Poor, the kinds of cases that Adrian was mentioning, to Muslim claimants, things having to do with headgear, for example, or beards and so forth. So that I think is, if not probable, more than merely possible. Other questions? Yeah, Professor Gregory.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to ask this question, but I'll just try. It's kind of the distinction between liberal philosophy and liberal politics that you've been talking about. So I appreciated in the beginning when you made this distinction between theoretical liberalism and the more anthropological, sociological attention to regimes of actual societies that you're calling sacramental. I might want to quibble that I don't think of progressivism as the true child, but the prodigal son of liberalism. So
right, that's an important conversation to have. Yeah.
But maybe for giving a gesture here to Rawls, one way to read him is that the very project of ideal theory, the way he perceives it, is in order to so-called work for change, go abstract, choose your moral exemplars and narrate your political history wisely, work for reflective equilibrium, work for overlapping consensus, precisely so as to not disrupt the customs of the people or the masses too quickly, appeal to stability. Why is that not potentially within the reasons of state discourse? I understand that maybe he's still going to be, on your view, a classical liberal who's driving by a master principle autonomy that's just trying to fulfill itself, and that he should just look inward for the source of his frustrations. But I think the Rawlsian would want to say, well, it's been pretty remarkably resilient for a self-contradictory politics. So on your political science read, why hasn't it collapsed under the weight of its own contradiction?
Well, there are a couple different questions involved here, all of which are good, but I would want to disentangle them.
Yeah.
One is the question of self-undermining. I think that there is the nature of advancing argument about mechanisms is that it both frees me from one argumentative burden and means I can't carry one argumentative burden, which is one cannot give anything like predictions about, okay, what I do think is true is that all mechanisms don't support predictions, but they support explanations. And if we want to understand what's observably happening in the world around us, we want to understand what's common between, let me see if I can do all of these, Hungary, Poland, Italy, Slovakia, Brexit, Trump, the list goes on, Vox in Spain. There seems to be some common dynamic at play in these cases. And what I'm trying to do is offer a kind of account that helps us get at the causal structures here. That's all one point. The point about the Rawlsians is, I just, as I tried to say, I'm skeptical that that kind of official theoretical discourse captures the actual dynamics of the regime. Oh, I mentioned, I wanted to get in a quick, right. So the idea, so this is an article in Boston Review where we have a conference of Rawlsians agonizing about what's happening, and it's focused to excess on Trump and not on what I take to be the comparative phenomenon, which is very striking. But the argument is, well, what we just need is more solidarity. We need solidarity between incumbents and subject populations, and when we have this solidarity, we'll reduce this backlash dynamic. But the problem is to explain why this solidarity will be supplied. That is, we need a causal explanation of what the motivations of liberal agents are and why they haven't been supplying the solidarity up till now. And my suggestion is that the structure of liberal motivation and behavior is that value rationality trumps the instrumental rationality of supplying solidaristic policies.
Just briefly,
If that made any sense.
that makes sense. And it may just be, I don't think it's semantic, but civic republicanism is not prone to these. I think of civic republicanism as a variant of liberalism. So maybe we're just fighting over what these terms are.
Well, yeah, I mean, as you, I'm sure you could do this better than I can. There's a well-known debate about how to classify republicanism as non-domination and whether it counts as a species of liberalism or not. I just say that insofar as the republicanism as non-domination impulse produces this sacramental urge to kind of overthrow the dominator, it's extraordinarily destabilizing. I think that part of liberalism is very much at play in what people call foreign policy neoconservatism, the idea that we need this sacramental moment of overthrowing the dominator in Libya, in Afghanistan, in Venezuela, whether or not it's ultimately instrumentally rational to do so. And we saw in cases like Libya that it's almost certainly turned out to be not instrumentally rational to do so, and has destabilized areas of the world in ways that actually hurt U.S. interests, in my view.
Can I ask a question about this?
Please, yeah.
On Eric's first question.
Yeah.
Why isn't the answer that the real attack,
Yeah.
Liberalism in your sense, on the traditional Judeo-Christian moral underpinnings of most of these societies, is less than 50 years old, or about 50 years old. You don't really get it until the 60s.
Yeah.
So just look at the United States, from the founders, through Lincoln, through Wilson, through FDR, all the way until, roughly Abingdon v. Shem.
Right.
You've got, here I'll borrow a Marxist analogy, you've got the structure of legal liberalism, but it's sitting atop the base of Judeo-Christian morality, to which all of those theorists appealed, and the reason they appealed to it is that it was functionally the public philosophy of the people.
Look, I think.
About about 60s, you begin,
Right.
especially with the Supreme Court. So
Yeah.
Roosevelt, you've all heard or read Roosevelt's prayer on D-Day. When he announces the D-Day invasion, he says a prayer and he invites the American public to pray with him. And everybody's right along. That is as much the governing structure of the country as the Constitution of the United States.
Right.
Kennedy's inaugural address, the sentiments that are expressed there, and so forth. The real gap, I think, begins to open up where liberal elites find themselves really rejecting that in serious ways. They see that as now problematic and illiberal. Is about the 60s. So when we ask why haven't the internal contradictions, if Adrian's right about there being them, why haven't those internal contradictions caused the collapse? Well, maybe that's, it's too soon to tell. It's 50 years, it's 50 years in, and if you look at Brexit, and if you look at Trump, and if you look at all these other things, maybe you see it happening right now.
Right. I mean, I think that's also an excellent point, Robbie. I would just say that I would love it if that point helped me out of the bind Eric's put me in, which is to give a kind of point prediction about, but I don't think it does. That is, the holdover of non-liberal norms and values in a liberal society that eventually corrodes under elite pressure is a real mechanism, but it doesn't tell us like when the corrosion will reach such a point. Yeah, exactly. So, right, I didn't see it as a response to Eric's point, but I tried to say that I had exempted myself from the force of Eric's point by just simply not even trying to.
I'm understanding prophecy is close.
Okay, very good. Yeah.
Let me toss something else in while
Yeah,
we're
please.
on
Yeah.
the subject. So on Trump, for 30 years at least, maybe more, but at least for 30 years, the Republican establishment has lamented that the party is dependent in a way that is bad for the party long term on evangelical Christian and other socially conservative voters, and that there should be a way, and we should find a way, to present ourselves as a party
Yep.
that is economically conservative, in this, which also means economically liberal in the more traditional sense. In other words,
Right.
free markets and free trade.
Right.
And get rid of the albatross of these social issues which
Right.
drag us down and cost us
Right.
elections. So Donald Trump comes along, and he seems to have perceived that the Republican establishment got it exactly wrong. It's the reverse of what he thought. You've
Right.
already seen the graph with
Yeah, exactly.
the quadrants, right?
Yeah,
And the
can you
quadrant
just
in
explain
which
that a
there
little
are
bit?
no
Yeah,
votes
right.
is the quadrant of economically conservative and socially liberal. So Trump himself abandons his social liberalism, which had been his entire life. On social issues for his entire life, he'd been not only liberal, extreme liberal. He abandons that. He embraces social conservatism and runs against free trade, free markets, limited government, all that stuff.
Exactly. And this is why I think that the beginning of wisdom about Trump is not to focus too much on the U.S. case and not to become obsessed with the U.S. case and to put him in some kind of comparative perspective, because what we see in all the cases I mentioned is exactly this pioneering of electoral actors competing in electoral politics who move to the upper left quadrant and succeed wildly by doing so. I think this describes Orban in Hungary, for example. The Hungarian government has pursued family policies which have turned out to be strikingly successful that could only be described as dirigiste, that is, they try to direct families towards having more children through elaborate schemes of subsidies and employment regulation and so on. And that's exactly this move towards the upper left, towards a combination of social conservatism and rejection of at least absolutist free market ideology.
You wanted to come in on that.
Yeah, just going back to the point you were raising about the unanimity of approval regarding Kennedy's inaugural or the D-Day prayer. Isn't the fault perhaps the fault isn't within liberalism itself, but maybe the problem is something diagnosed by Christopher Lasch, where you have this chasm develop between the Gnostics that are leading liberalism and the actual political.
But this is my point. This is exactly my point.
That's a really good point.
No, you could see my whole piece as a I don't know, Chicagoized version of Lash. But this is exactly right. And the problem is that my suggestion was about a mechanism by which liberal incumbent rulers, that is, elites in liberal polities, undermine their own position through this commitment, value rational commitment to a sacramental dynamism. And this is entirely consistent with that.
By Lash, when he refers to Lash, this is the late Christopher Lash, who was a sociologist and social critic who wrote a number of important books, and the two that are relevant here are Culture of Narcissism, some of you are probably familiar with that, and The Revolt of the Elite.
Are they sacrificing their position, or are we really down a path where they're going to make themselves extinct? They're going to take care of themselves and will resolve the issue.
Not quite seeing the force of that distinction. That if they make themselves extinct, that seems to be.
Or they prevail.
Yeah.
Or they prevail.
The voter,
Yeah, that's yeah.
Liberalism is going to have to dissolve the people and elect a new one.
Well, no, I agree. I think in the short run. So this is getting at the end of the short run, what you see is in the increasing divorce between liberalism and democracy is polities in which liberal incumbents try to reduce democratic input in order to preserve their position. Now, the question is, how long can that strategy be sustained? And that's what I got at towards the end.
You've had your hand up for so long, and I'm sorry to get so late in recognizing you, but you get the last question.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Very interesting discussion. But let me ask the question a different way. And I totally agree with you that the liberals fight between themselves. And because of that, and perhaps because they are trying to compromise between themselves and between everybody else outside, the policy and all of that comes out muddled the way you have gone through. But the question, I think, is you're using the failure of liberalism because of what is going on in Europe and elsewhere. And my pushback on that would be is that that's a result exactly of the opposite thing that happened. It is a result of all the unbridled capitalism that moved into markets where labor laws were non-existent and taking advantage of those movement of the capital and the people along with it, including the corrupt regimes that were out there that absolutely were totally against liberalism per se. And the result was that we have a massive failure throughout the world of prosperity and progress that got stopped because of that.
I'm not sure I entirely followed the categories, but I don't see that as the opposite of my story. I see that as part and parcel of my story. So I tried to say in the part after Obergefell, economic liberalism expressed in the ideology of creative destruction and disruption is exactly part of the phenomenon that's caused backlash both in America and in Europe. And this is, I think, obvious in the case of Brexit, where communities, especially in the mid and north of England, who voted powerfully for Brexit are the communities who feel disrupted by globalized trade, by neoliberal policy, economic and immigration policies, and who use the democratic tools to fight back in a certain way, regardless of whether that's good or bad. Sorry. Yeah. Please.
Well, it's discussions like these after wonderful lectures like that make me so grateful to Princeton University for allowing us to launch the Madison program nearly 20 years ago and to carry on for all these years. And Adrian, I want to thank you for
thank you,
making this
Rob.
such a wonderful
Thank you.